Well, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Jamie. Welcome.
I want to start this morning with our minds just beginning with the thought of caution. And when you hear that word caution, you know, at some point in our lives we learn to be cautious. And maybe you can think of, I don't know, if you think back in your life, maybe you can think of the first big accident you can recall. Something that you've maybe been hurt or, you know, and what you've learned from that. I know myself, I can think back to a time when I remember going down a hill and off of a bike jump. And I must have been 5 years old, but I vividly remember the scars and scrapes that I had and going to the hospital that day and what I learned from that. You know, when it comes to caution, at a certain time, there's a saying, you know, throwing caution into the wind. And I think as we're younger, maybe that's something that we do a little more easily, but it's a learned experience. I also recall with my children, when you came into our old house, you come in the front door and the living room was off to the left and we had our staircase going up on the right. And we had, there was, you know, a railing there with the steel bars there for the railing. And I remember I was in the living room doing some work and the kids were playing over on the stairs. And they'll remember this quite vividly themselves. And Haley must have been 5, Josiah maybe 2. And they were playing with these stuffed animals and throwing them down the stairs. And Haley had this giant purple Care Bear. And she was throwing it down the stairs, and I could hear my youngest son just cackling. He was laughing so hard at this bear tumbling down the stairs. And then I heard the words, "Can you do that?" And I looked over to see Josiah going, "Uh-huh." And away he went. And now, you know, wooden stairs. And I'd like to say they were carpeted. They weren't carpeted. And you know, I'm sure they both learned something that day. You know, Haley, you know, don't ever do that. And Josiah, don't listen to your sister when she tells you to do that. Especially after once you're going, I don't know what would have happened. Once you hit your head on the first step, you realize this is a mistake. And sometimes we've done that, right? You've gone into something, you're like, this is a mistake. And there's no stopping it now. He's already started and away he goes. So we learn when we're younger. But as we get older, maybe sometimes we're a little too cautious. You know, as we're younger, you know, we see that water, we cannonball in, and we're older, it takes like an hour to get up to our knees, and I'm like, too cold, I'm not going to do it, right? And so as we get older, we tend not to use these words, I'm all in. It's all or nothing. Here goes anything. I mean, when's the last time you heard someone who's older saying some of these words, you know? No turning back now. I mean, these are words when we're younger, you hear them all the time. But as we get older, maybe we're a little more cautious. And this is okay for many things, but when it comes to our faith, I fear this is something we don't always verbalize it, but we're a little bit too cautious in our faith. Maybe it shows, you know, we're a little too cautious. We're not really sure, you know, I'm pretty sure God exists, and I'm pretty sure that this is going to lead to the promises, but you know, you're not 100% sure, and so that caution keeps us from jumping all in. That caution holds us back from, you know, saying, you know, it's all or nothing. And we try and find that middle ground. And Jesus said there's no middle ground. You're either for me or you're against me. You're either all in or nothing. And so we have to make our decisions. And as we're going through now Philippians, we're getting near the end of the letter. We're talking about Paul's prison epistles. And this is something that I think Paul wants us to understand as he's writing this letter to the Philippians. And of course, he writes letters from prison to Philippians, Colossians, the Ephesians, and to Philemon, that's the brother in the church. And Paul wants them to understand that you need to be all in. Because these letters aren't just for those churches. These letters are for us today. And Paul is saying, you have to be all in. He's saying, listen, I am all in, and follow my example. Paul was all in. There's no doubting that. I mean, the guy's writing from prison. These churches were established by Paul. The Philippians, he's the one that planted the church. He never gave up. He's found himself now in prison or under house arrest, and he hasn't given up. Paul is all in. Paul's able to say, one thing I do know, forgetting what is behind and reaching forward to what is ahead, I pursue the goal, the prize promised by God. And so there's no looking back. He's only looking ahead. He's going to walk ahead to pursue the goal. And Paul would say he's got a new citizenship. He says, our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from there. Verse 20 of Philippians chapter 3. Our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await for a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ. He will transform the body of our humble condition into the likeness of his glorious body. Paul is all in, and he's talking about a new citizenship. And we're the same. One thing I do, forgetting what is behind, I pursue my goal, the prize promised. And he says our citizenship is in heaven. The prize is that he will transform the body of our humble condition into the likeness of his glorious body. We have a newness of life that's coming. If this is all we have, live for it. If you don't believe that this promise is true, if you don't believe that Jesus really was who he said he was, and that he had a new glorious body, and that he's going to give you a new body, then live for the moment. Do everything you can to enjoy time now, if that's what you truly believe, and it'll be a sad outcome. Because you'll soon find out that you've been falling down the stairs and bumping our heads, and one day you'll wake up at the bottom and you realize, what have I done with my life? And by then we realize we've gone the wrong direction. But Paul is saying, no, this is true. And he's so convinced he's in prison. He talks about a citizenship. Now, Paul, he understood citizenship. Do you know that Paul was a Roman citizen, which was, back then, that was a very valuable thing to have the Roman citizenship. As a matter of fact, there was one time when Paul was preaching to the Jews, and the Jews were getting so riled up, the Romans took him away, and they were going to beat him. And so we read this in Acts chapter 22. Oh, it's not working. Can you flip ahead? There we go. In Acts chapter 22, as they stretch him out for the lashes, Paul said, is it right for you to scourge a man who's a Roman citizen? That was one of the privileges. You weren't allowed to have that happen without any kind of hearing or condemnation. And we read in verse 26, when the centurion heard this, centurion's in charge of 100 soldiers or so, he went and reported to the commander. He's like, oh, this is a problem. He goes to the commander, and the commander doesn't just say to the centurion, okay, go back and find out more. The commander knows this is a big deal. So the commander himself goes to Paul, and he says, how did you get your citizenship? He doesn't believe him. And so this is a big deal. And so he says, I bought this citizenship for a large amount of money. But Paul says, I was born a citizen. And when he heard this, we read, those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. The commander was alarmed when he realized he was a Roman citizen, that he had bound him. So being a Roman citizen was a very special thing. This was a high privilege to be a Roman citizen. Not only was Paul a Roman citizen, Paul was a Jew, not just any Jew. In this same letter, in chapter 3, Paul talks about his own circumstance. He said, circumcised on the 8th day. He's a descendant of Abraham, the nation of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin. Jacob's wife Rachel, she had 2 children, Joseph and Benjamin. He was from the youngest, Benjamin. He says he was a Hebrew of Hebrews. Not just that, he was a leader of the Hebrews. He was a Pharisee, not just any Pharisee. He was zealous, and he was respected for it amongst the Pharisees, persecuting the church. Regarding the righteousness in the law, blameless. Paul said, I had everything going for me. As a Hebrew of Hebrews, as a Roman citizen, Paul had everything going for him. And yet, what does he say next? But everything that was a gain to me, I considered a loss for Christ. He says he's willing to throw it all away. It's nothing. That Roman citizenship, being a Jew of Jews, being a Pharisee, being a teacher that people looked up to, being highly respected, having lots of money, being what the world says is important, Paul said, that's nothing compared to me belonging to Christ and being a servant of Christ. I'll give it all up. And he did. He's in prison. He's writing this letter from house arrest. Paul was willing to give it all up. He was serious. But you know what that meant? He got to see things no one else saw. Mysteries were revealed to him. And Paul, no matter all the challenges he went through, Paul saw God there with him. He learned to trust God because he saw how God works. In our lives, when we trust God and you see strange things happen, and when you put your faith in him, it might be years down the line when you're like, wow. But never forget, in all things God works for the good. And you know, Paul's able to write in this letter some amazing passages that we quote all the time. He says, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." He knows he lives for Christ and he is totally committed to this. He's able to say at the end of this letter, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice." And he goes on to say, "In this I rejoice." He's under house arrest in prison. Remember, there's people that are trying to harm him, saying bad things about him. He can't be there to defend himself. And Paul is under house arrest in that location. He's able to rejoice, and he's able to say, we can rejoice. And you know what else he says? He says, don't worry about anything. But in everything, through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. He says, I can rejoice and I don't worry. He's not just saying you don't worry. He's saying I don't worry, because that's what his life was like. He knew that he was in the hands of God, and he knew him who was faithful and would see his promises through. And you know what else Paul was able to say? I'm able to do all things through him who strengthens me. He's able to say rejoice. He's able to say don't worry. And he's able to say I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Because he realizes he's not alone. He realizes that being a citizen in the kingdom doesn't just mean that you have a little, piece of paper that says you're a citizen. It means that you belong. You have a belonging. You have an identity that is greater than anything in this world. An identity that is out of this world. And so while we walk in this world, we serve a king who has called us to action. A king who has called us to say, remember who you are, and I need you. Jesus is the one who sent him out on this missionary journey and with this mission to the Gentiles and Jews alike. And Jesus is the one who sends us, go into the world and make disciples. We have been called by our king. We have been given a citizenship, and if this citizenship means anything to us, then we have a commitment. Not just for the king, we have a commitment that will be a blessing to us as well. So we are called to commitment. We know a lot about commitment, and we know a lot about commitment. Sometimes, though, I don't think we really fully understand how commitment should work within the kingdom, being a citizen of the kingdom. See, we understand commitment. Think about the commitment that we give. Your school. We commit years to school, and we focus. And by the way, all these things that we're committed to, commitment's not wrong. But if that's all we're committed to, if that takes all of our energy, all of our focus, then we have a problem. We are called to be committed to Christ first. And these other commitments we have, they follow along with our life in Christ. We have all kinds of commitments. We commit, when you think about a new job. When the boss wants you to work overtime, sure. Sometimes we'll even go in early, we'll work for free. We'll do some hours, stay late, go in early. We'll skip our lunches. We'll work overtime. If we have plans with our family, we'll put that aside. We want to impress the boss with a new job. And so sometimes we work so hard. We know what commitment's like with our jobs. Sometimes we buy a house, a fixer-upper, and we know we're going to be committed to this. And that's a lot of commitment, a lot of time, and we're willing to do it. We go and we try and we research how to fix the house, how to build it up, and how to make it a good investment. When it comes to our vacations, sometimes we can demonstrate commitment in our vacations. All of our spare hours. We look for the best wardrobe, what we're going to wear, where we're going to go, where we're going to go and see, where we're going to find the cheapest flights. And that's not all wrong. But if that's all our life is, if it's, one commitment to another, and Christ is not a part of it. Whether it's sports and you look at the commitment into sports, the cost, the time, our hobbies, new cars, whatever it might be, there's a ton of commitments that we have. And all these commitments can soon override our commitment to Christ if we're not careful. That's the world creeping in. Paul didn't seem like he was worried about that stuff. He was doing research on where am I going to go next to spread the gospel. And when he's in prison, he's like, how am I going to help this church? He even writes in one of his letters, under all this, he's got the pressure of concern for all the churches. In his spare time, thinking about the churches and how he can help. In our spare time, we have a lot of spare time. Maybe we can consider some of our commitment to our citizenship. Commitment to the ministry that God has called us. Maybe we can take some initiatives and some of the things that we can commit to and watch what God will do with it. Just as Paul was committed, and look what Paul got to see. Look at the churches that grew and flourished and in turn helped him. And as the church grew, he watched the kingdom expand. He watched the gospel message getting out into the world through others. As he writes in this letter, and he writes about others who are doing ministry. And he's watching them grow, and he sees young people like Timothy and Titus, and he sees these young men that they're continuing to grow, and he sees what's happening in the churches, and he can be encouraged. Maybe if we gave more commitment, maybe we get to see what God's doing through us, and we've been already seeing that. Many of us are already committed. We can't lose focus of that commitment. Paul says, our citizenship is in heaven, stand firm. And so as our commitment, maybe we can do some research. We look at the day and age right now. We just look at what's been happening within the congregation. Look what's happening in society. Right now we've got a large influx of people, and there's a lot of needs out there. There's people looking for jobs, so maybe we can commit to helping. Someone maybe can take some time to help someone build a resume, help find a job, help someone find a place to live. Maybe take someone who's a difficult person. Maybe they lost their family or someone who would have helped them learn life lessons when they were younger. And now they're out on the street or they're just having a difficult time. No one wants to be with them. And we can invite them along with us to disciple them, teach them, help them to learn. Offer meals to someone. Visit those who are shut-ins, who can't get out. Maybe we have a commitment to a prayer ministry. Maybe we open our doors to someone. That's a difficult thing to do. Open our homes to someone in need. Maybe we start an initiative. Not just waiting for someone to say we need help here or here and sign up on a list. Maybe we take the initiative to say, God, what can I do? And we begin an initiative. Often, there's I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but I think of, even what we have out in the foyer and before church begins, we have some muffins and coffee during the class time. People are out there when they first come in, and it's turned into a wonderful ministry. But no one said we need someone to do this ministry. Someone in the congregation just said, I want to start something. And they just took that on. And so think of how many other things we can be doing. Think of all the other things that will happen when we take the initiative. Maybe we take some time, we commit to the youth of our congregation. What would that look like? To take the young people out, to offer them a ride somewhere, just to take them all out. Someone did that to their class a couple of years ago. They took their class to Wonderland. That was like 5 or 6 years ago. And those people never forgot that day. They still talk about that. And, that's a teacher who took some time. That wouldn't have been easy. To go for a whole day to Wonderland and stand around and wait for them to have fun. It's not like they were on the rides with them, but this is what we're talking about. Commitment in being able to serve. Commitment in ministry. And watch what God will do. Someone, Mark DeVries, in his book, Family-Based Youth Ministry, he talked about a football team. And he said, I've often wondered what it would be like if football coaches approach their work like a lot of youth ministry happens. He says, for example, if a player was too busy to show up for practice and the coaches just said, well, we'll miss you. I hope you're able to make it next week. Thanks for coming. Hope you come back next time. You can imagine if that's what the coach did. He goes on to say, imagine if one of the parents called and said, my son thinks practice is boring. He doesn't want to come anymore. Could you make it a little more fun? The coach down the street or in the other city, their youth like it a little more. Can you do what they're doing? I mean, imagine what would happen. He says, imagine if questionnaires were sent out to players about what they'd like to see and have changed on the team. He says, I can just imagine the answers. Short practices, more winning. He goes on to say, between trying to keep everyone happy and giving every student a good experience, the coach would squeeze in a little time for football practice. He's trying to make a point. He says, we seldom raise expectations high enough. And in the church, he says, if we had expectations for people, if we expected commitment from the church like a football team does, people will be all up in arms, and you're too legalistic and this is a problem. He makes a good point. And this isn't to say, shame on us. We're doing a lot of good things. But this is just getting us to think about the commitment that I'm not calling up here saying you need to do more. I'm saying this is what Paul's saying in this letter. He's fully committed. He's saying, be careful to commit yourself because you are a citizen of something far greater. And you can get clouded and blinded by the world, and you can forget what God is doing through his church. You can forget all the good things that can happen, and you get caught up in just doing things for the sake of doing them. And soon, and we've seen this in many churches where, things just seem to die off. Paul says, listen, commitment is what we're called to. And then he goes on to say, follow my example as we learned last week as Jim presented to us. Do what you have learned and received and heard from me and seen in me. The same commitment Paul has, he's encouraging us to do that as well. And if you think about that, would you be willing to go to prison? Would you be willing, by the way, we're all in different situations. Some of us have families. We're all going to do different things. But think about the level of commitment Paul had and ask, how do I up the level of commitment in my life, in my circumstances? Now, Paul didn't have a family. He wasn't married. He didn't have different responsibilities there with children. And some of us are in the same situation as Paul. So how do we follow it through? Paul says, do what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me. Join in imitating me. Philippians chapter 3 and Philippians chapter 4. He's getting this across. And then he reminds us, as citizens of heaven, live your life worthy of the gospel of Christ. He goes on to say, stand firm in one spirit, in one accord, contending together. Remember that our commitment is not just to our king. Our citizenship, our belonging is to a king and to a body, the church, his people. And so we contend together. We are one spirit, one accord, one mind, Paul would go on to say. In chapter 2, verse 1, we're like-minded. And as we imitate him, we set an example so that others imitate us. And so we contend together. And this is a great privilege. And finally, we stand firm. You see, being committed is not just about what we can do for God. There's a blessing for us. We need to stand firm in our faith because we're in a war. We're committed to the ministry. We're committed to this war fighting for the king. And it's for our good. When we're in the scriptures, putting on our armor, we're protecting ourselves from the attacks that are out there. We're recognizing that temptation and sin will keep us down, pushing us down the mountain that we've been climbing, keeping us from our relationship with God. Don't give the devil a foothold. And so Paul would say, we are one accord, we contend together, but we also stand firm and we help one another stand. There was a story that, I'll end with this story. It was a little parable that someone told. Someone heard it down in South America, one of the churches. I can't remember where I heard this story, but basically it was someone who sold the house. They were selling a house for a large sum of money, and someone came and said, I can't afford that. Could you sell it for, half the price? And this person thought, well, I'll tell you what. I'll sell you the house for half the price, but under one condition. I get one piece of that house. I just want one little board above the front door there with the nail that's attached. You can't touch that. Everything else you can have. Deal. They struck a deal, and the new family moved in, and they continued to live there for some time. And finally, the old owner said, you know what? I want my house back. I want to buy it back from you. No, it's not for sale. I'm sorry. You sold it to me. I still own that nail. I want to have the whole house. No, you can't have that. And so the old owner decided he would go, and he hung a dead carcass, an animal, from that nail. And the stench just grew worse and worse. And finally the family said, we can't live here anymore. This is terrible. Fine, we'll sell it to you. And the point of that parable is that sometimes we don't realize it. When we're not fully committed, you're leaving Satan that little nail in your home. You're leaving Satan that little nail in your life in order to weasel his way back into your life. And so, be careful. You can't be 80% committed. A spouse who is 80% committed is not committed at all. And we've committed ourselves as a bride of Christ. And so Jesus calls for 100% commitment. And so whatever that looks like in your life, the call this morning is to ask yourself, what does it mean for me to be 100% committed to Christ? And to remember that I'm a citizen of his kingdom.